question 6, we get the chance to have a think about what we do when we have two variables to analyse, and one is numerical and one is categorical. This mix of data types means that we have to think about how we're going to summarise the data. Specifically, question 6, we're working with the credit card data, the extended file, and we're told that pivot tables are a useful tool in Excel that will allow us to easily create a summary of data that can then be converted into a chart. Certainly we can use them for two variables, and that means that we're creating a contingency table. So what we're going to do here is, for part A, we're going to construct a summary of the average interest rate for cards with and without rewards. So we're going to focus on two variables. We're going to look at interest rate, which is numerical, as well as reward program, which is categorical. So we've got that mixed combination for our bivariate data. We're going to start off with this summary table, just looking at some averages, and then we're going to add in another variable, and we're going to in fact have institution type as well. So this will almost be trivariate analysis. We'll have our rewards, which is categorical, institution, which is categorical, and then we're still going to use interest rate, and we'll do that by constructing an average. And we can make some charts as well for those. Okay, so we need to start with the pivot table. So we click on A1, the top left hand cell, we go to Insert, Pivot Table. I'm going to go to a new worksheet just so I've got some more space, but just make sure that it's found all of the data. It has, so I'll say OK, and once again I see that skeleton table. Now I'm going to start off with just the most basic summary we could do, which is to look at the interest rate for cards with rewards as well as without rewards. So we put reward into the row fields and we get no rewards, yes rewards. Interest rate, well, we put it into the data items, and Excel has summed, so it is guessed wrong, but we can double click on that sum and change to average, and that will get us now the average interest rate for each of those categories, and I can adjust the number of decimal places, and I can therefore tell you that cards without rewards on average have an interest rate of 12.16%, whereas cards with rewards on average have a rate of 17.19. So clearly, given that there's such a big difference between those two categories, that suggests that whether or not there's a rewards program is having quite an important impact. There's just over 5% difference between those two groups in terms of the average rate being charged. Now that's not something that we'd be able to pick up if we looked at the interest rate column by itself. So it's nice to do that type of one variable analysis to get an initial understanding of what kind of interest rates we're seeing. But adding in extra variables, as we have done here, gives us the chance to think about how those other variables influence our variable of interest, which in this case is interest rate. And we can see that rewards program does indeed have an impact. It appears that rewards cards do have a higher average rate than non-rewards cards. Now we can go that step further and in fact add in another variable. Now I'm just going to make a new pivot table so we can see both at the same time. So I'll go back and just repeat the process. I'll insert a pivot table, but this time I'll actually say that I want it to go below the previous one. Okay, so same process again, and while we do have a bit of a chance to sort of play around with what goes in the rows, what goes in the columns, I'll just put rewards back in the rows. That's where we had it before. This time, instead of just adding interest rate, we're going to add institution type. Now, if I dragged rewards or institution type into the data items, pretty much this would just go through and count up how many cards from each institution type have rewards and don't have rewards, and it wouldn't link in interest rate. So if we are wanting to go further than just bivariate analysis and think about this sort of trivariate analysis, and we have this sort of combination of variables, certainly looking at average can be a good way to introduce that third variable. So put interest rate in to the data items. It's summed, which doesn't really tell us anything, so we do need to adjust that again. say average, and we'll just tidy those up in terms of the number of decimal places, make them a bit easier to look at. And okay, well now we can see, well, okay, we've got the three variables into this chart. Overall, we're still seeing those grand totals for the average rate for no cards and yes cards, but now it's split up in terms of institution type as well. So we can say, okay, well for banks, it's 13.73 for no cards, 16.74 for yes cards. So the yes cards are higher, but the difference isn't as great. For credit unions, the no cards have an average rate of 11%, which is in fact lower than the overall average and certainly lower than banks. For the yes cards, it's 17.66%, so it's higher than the overall average and higher than what we saw for banks. So we have an even broader spread between the no and the yes cards. We're seeing similar results for other institutions. So that does suggest that the institution type has an impact as well. There seems to be less of a difference between the two cards for banks, although there is still some difference indicated by the averages, but for credit unions and others there's certainly a big impact on the basis of whether or not we have a rewards program. So that's the type of thing we can do there, and it's really just a matter of looking at the numbers and really thinking about what they're telling us. Now we can turn those into charts. If I start with the first more basic summary, I can just go into my options, pivot chart, just make a basic column. Now this would need tidying up. In fact, I'll just make it a bit smaller. Pretty much this just gives us a visual of the average between no and yes cards. So it gives us a chance to visually see that difference. Here possibly the table is more useful because we can actually see the numbers, but that does give us a visual perspective. If I go into my second pivot table, again create a chart. Now I've got the sort of clustered, stacked, 100% stack, so I've got some options there. I'll say OK. Now this is what happens if it's clustered, so you're getting the different colours for the different types. We've got yes and no. So that's one perspective. We can certainly see that for our banks there's less of a difference. Maybe that's not the best way to show it. We might want to swap the columns and the rows around. We can go in, we can try the stacked. So that's where we break up the yes and no cards and then into their institution types. So some of this does depend on sort of the order you want to talk about the variables in your discussion and sort of what your focus is. If we have a look at a stacked, 100% stacked, we can see that, well, in this view, they look quite similar. So it's really just a matter of going through, possibly here. Let's maybe delete that one. Let's switch these around. And we'll go back in and we'll make a chart. Okay, so possibly this starts to give us a better perspective. We can see that for banks there is that smaller difference between the two types of rewards, non-rewards cards, but much larger for credit unions and other. And so if that was the point that you were trying to make, well then that would probably be our best chart. So a bit of choice there. Always remember to look at the tables and charts you're producing and really think about whether you can look and see the message that you're wanting to convey, and that message in any written analysis should match up to the visual. So it doesn't take long to experiment a little bit, but it's really worthwhile to make sure that you have a good chart.